songs all declared God's greatness, His protection, His love, and His presence. But He was nowhere to be found in that dark, cold office. I was frozen in fear. This was going to be the devil's night, and somehow I just knew it. The music was still blaring when suddenly I heard two loud bangs against the door, and bam! The double doors into my office busted open. I looked up and saw a police officer looking at me over my desk. He yelled, "Mr. Chriswell, are you okay?" I honestly thought I was seeing things. It took him all about 3 steps into my office when I realized that this was for real. And my mind began screaming, "She did it! She actually went this far!" Before I begin to share some of the darkest parts of my personal life, I first want to remind you that the Bible is a true story of paradise lost by sinners and paradise again being found by sinners. The good news of God's salvation through Jesus Christ can only be fully understood and appreciated when, by God's grace, we can see it through the lens of our own past ignorance, filth, foolishness, sins, and even rebellion against God. Christ Himself said He came to save lost sinners, not the righteous, Mark 2:17. And He said that he who has been forgiven much sin will love God much, Luke 7:47. In an affront to legalistic or self-righteous people who look down on others, God was even pleased to bring the life and salvation of His Son Jesus Christ directly through a genealogy filled with sin and scandal. In a quick reading of Jesus' family line in Matthew 1, we can find incest, Tamar and Judah, intermarriage, Boaz and Ruth, prostitution, Rahab, and adultery and even murder, David and Bathsheba. God's word is very transparent, and it does not try to whitewash or hide the dirt in the lives of some of its most beloved personalities. But on the contrary, it actually showcases their raw trials, their scandals, and their sins. As a result, you and I can read the Bible and say, wow, if God can forgive and use him or her, surely He can forgive and use me. I too am following this pattern and sharing of my personal journal entries in this program by transparently sharing details from my own life in hopes that you'll be encouraged and able to also say, wow, if God can forgive and redeem the mess in Michael's life, surely He can do so in my life as well. My journal entries and the stories that I'm going to share include the life and sins of some others who are involved. I have changed the names or even left out the names of a few to protect their identity. Having said that, I wish to point out that there are no sinners in any of these stories that I have not completely forgiven, and more importantly, who couldn't be forgiven by the grace of God through their sincere faith and repentance, should God grant it to them. 2 Timothy 2:25. I would also like to make it clear that the worst of sins committed against me by God's grace have all turned to be the very best things that have ever happened to me spiritually, and I am so thankful for each and every one of them now. I do not in any way despise the discipline God has given me, nor the tools or people He's used to do so. God, in His infinite wisdom, knows the exact kind of suffering and affliction we each need to become more like Jesus Christ to His glory, which is His ultimate purpose in creating us and saving us. Romans 8:29. May God bless you as you listen. Matthew 10:27. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. Ephesians 5:11, 13 through 14. Have nothing to do with fruitless deeds of darkness. Rather, expose them. Everything exposed by the light becomes visible. for it is the light that makes everything visible. December 31st, 2009, 11:35 p.m., New Year's Eve. On a night that is meant for celebrating the arrival of a new year and a fresh new start, a time when you're supposed to rejoice with special friends and family, I was all alone and scared to death about our future. While all 5 of our small children were peacefully asleep in their rooms, I was about to taste hell on just the other side of the house. The memory of me sitting on the back porch just weeks earlier telling the devil, "Go ahead, take your best shot," flooded my mind. Her parents had agreed to watch the children on New Year's Eve 2009. My wife Jennifer and I went to dinner at the Cape Canaveral Pier House restaurant, and I was so hopeful that the evening alone at the ocean might help each of us to catch our breath and make one more attempt at moving forward rather than quitting on our marriage. Dinner was rather uneventful, even sort of pleasant. So to me, I had a small glimmer of hope as we left the restaurant that night. On the way home, we decided to stop by my father's house to let him and my stepbrother know that we couldn't go with them on New Year's Day. They came to the door and I began apologizing, saying that Jennifer and I had been having some serious problems in our marriage, but that we were going to be trying to get some help and to work on it. Just then, she cut me off, grabbed my arm, looked at both of them and said, "No, we don't have problems. Michael has some problems, and Michael is going to be going to a psychiatrist to get some help." I was stunned. I was shocked, and I was completely humiliated, all at the same time. It was one of the most disrespectful and humiliating things she had ever done to me in front of others. I could feel my blood starting to boil, and within just minutes of driving down the highway, I blew up and just screamed at her for like 5 minutes in total disgust that she continued to accept zero responsibility for anything wrong in the marriage. Finally, I caught my breath, I shut up, and we drove home in complete silence. I had been very ready to leave the marriage several other times over the years, and I had always stayed. But now I felt absolutely certain I was dead inside and the marriage must be over. By the time we arrived at home, I was so angry and in so much pain that I wanted to leave the house and just go stay with a friend. I could not even stand to hear her voice at this point. It was already 11:30 at night, but I started texting a few friends to see if I could come stay at their place. I had just sold my truck, another way to try to make her happy. And so all I had at the time was my street motorcycle. When she saw how seriously upset I was, she began to try to appease me to stay. When she saw I was not budging, she began threatening to call the police if I left without telling her where I was going. She kept saying she was worried about me leaving on New Year's Eve and driving somewhere on my motorcycle at night. I was done talking. She kept following me all over the house and talking to me, and I just kept telling her to please leave me alone and to get out of the office so I could be alone. She just kept badgering me and asking me, "Are you going to leave, Michael? Are you going to leave? Just tell me, are you going to leave on your motorcycle, Michael?" I said, "I don't know. But if you're truly worried about my safety, the safest thing for both of us right now is for you to leave this office and leave me alone. Just please leave me alone." She finally left and I locked myself in our home office. Within a few minutes, I was sitting on the hard, cold wood floor in our home office next to my desk, rocking back and forth, wrapped in my own arms, desperately trying to comfort myself from the gut-wrenching pain. I was physically, mentally, and emotionally exhausted. And on top of that, I was now being spiritually tormented. I had worship music from Michael W. Smith blasting through my computer speakers. I was trying so hard to find God's help and to distract myself from the searing emotional pain. I couldn't stop crying, and I was absolutely scared to death. I might have been a 36-year-old man in my body, But spiritually and emotionally, I felt like a lost little child in the woods who couldn't find their mommy or daddy anywhere. As I sat just rocking back and forth, singing with the songs, I could hear words of hope and words of rescue, but I couldn't feel them as my current reality. The songs all declared God's greatness, His protection, His love, and His presence. But He was nowhere to be found in that dark, cold office. I was frozen in fear. This was going to be the devil's night, and somehow I just knew it. I began regretting so much that I had taunted him. Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. The music was still blaring when suddenly I heard two loud bangs against the door, and bam! The double doors into my office busted open. I looked up and saw a police officer looking at me over my desk. He yelled, "Mr. Chriswell, are you okay?" I honestly thought I was seeing things. It took him all about 3 steps into my office when I realized that this was for real. And my mind began screaming, "She did it. She actually went this far. She knows I'm going to leave the marriage and it'll be humiliating for her. So now she has found an excuse to call the cops so that it looks like I'm some sort of a bipolar maniac, just like she's been accusing me of to our friends and family." I was caught so off guard that I simply could not process the terrifying reality of what was happening fast enough. This horrible evening had now turned into a scandalous and evil night. Sure, our marriage had been in crisis, and I wanted out of it, but I never saw anything like this coming. The wife of my youth, the woman I was with for 16 years and had coffee with every morning, my business partner and the mother of my 5 children, had just betrayed me by assassinating my character in order to protect hers. Job 19:19. Those I love have turned against me. Matthew 26:23. Jesus replied, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me." As I got up off the floor and sat down in my office chair, the police officer started asking me questions. "How are you feeling tonight, Mr. Chriswell?" I said, "Sir, I'm in complete shock. I was sitting in my own house, in my own office, behind a locked door, and a police officer just busted in my door. How would you feel right about now?" He said, "Sir, I knocked and knocked." I replied, "Yes, and you could tell I was listening to blasting loud music and I couldn't hear anything." He then said, "I'm sorry I startled you, but we did receive a call from your wife and have to come out and make sure everything is okay, so I just need to ask you some questions, Mr. Chriswell." By now, I was shaking and starting to breathe heavy. It was late at night, and I was completely exhausted, running now off of pure adrenaline and fear. I kept shaking my head and saying, "I have no idea why my wife called you or why you're here. I can't believe this is happening." He said, "Don't worry. No one is going to jail as of yet. I just need to find out what's going on." I thought to myself, boy, that's comforting to know. No one's going to jail as of yet? That's kind of like a doctor saying to a patient who came in with a cold, "Don't worry, you're not dying as of yet." He started his questions. "Mr. Chriswell, have you been drinking tonight?" I said, "No, I've never been drunk in my whole life, and I don't even drink, officer, except maybe a glass of wine every month or so." "Have you taken any narcotics or any medications?" I replied, "Never." Then he asked, "Do you have any guns in the house, any knives or swords or other weapons?" I said, "No, and I can't believe you're asking me these questions. I'm not that kind of person at all. I'm a God-fearing Christian man. I was in here crying and praying and listening to Christian worship music, for crying out loud, when you came in. My wife and I are just having marital problems. I think our marriage is over, but that's it. Nothing crazy is going on except the fact that she's now blown this way out of proportion and called you guys to make me look like a freak. I was just locked in here to keep away from her because she wouldn't leave me alone." "I understand, Mr. Chriswell. This is just routine to make sure everyone is okay and that everyone will be safe here tonight. I said, why don't you come over here to my computer and I'll show you who I am. I'm a successful business owner, a respected speaker and a Christian man. Some of the top business people in Orlando are my friends. I can show you a video of people talking about who I am. He said, I understand, Mr. Chriswell, but bad things happen regardless of social status. I might remind you of the millionaire who lives in Isleworth and who just shot and killed his wife in their home not too long ago. That comment shut me up, and I stopped desperately trying to show him I was not some nut. Just 90 days earlier, Bob Ward, a millionaire developer who lived in Isleworth, had murdered his wife. Isleworth is the wealthiest neighborhood in all of Central Florida, if not the whole state of Florida. It's where Tiger Woods lived before his divorce. I eventually caught my breath and calmed down, and he finished all his questions in the report. I just sat at my desk with my head down, feeling like I was in a time warp or being sucked into some black hole. Psalm 55, 12 through 13. It is not an enemy who taunts me. I could bear that. It's not my foes who so arrogantly insult me. I could have hidden from them. Instead, it is you, my equal, my companion, and close friend. I felt like my soul had just been torn right in half. I had been doing okay against the accusations around the house and to our family, but this was a whole new level of betrayal. Evil had just stepped up the level of gameplay. I screamed in my mind, someone please wake me up from this nightmare. This cannot be happening to me. This cannot be happening to my family. God, where are you? Why don't you stop this? Please help me, Lord. I had no idea that this night would be but a mere taste of evil and destruction that was about to come into my life. I would live to see hell on earth before it was over. A legal assistant who never actually worked on my divorce would one day tell me that in 10,000 divorces that she had processed, she had never seen one like mine. It would cause me to shake in my most faithful pair of boots and would once again cause me to eventually question everything I ever thought I knew about God, the devil, people, and life. If it was the last thing I did, I would never give up running to God until I got answers to my burning questions. I wanted to know, how did my life end up like this? Did I deserve this? Was I being paid back for something I did long ago? Or is it possible I really am a victim? Did I fail because of a lack of wisdom? Did the devil get permission to destroy my life such that Job and I are going to high-five in heaven like spiritual blood brothers? Was this a generational curse of some kind? Why does the last 10 years of my life look so much like Joseph's in the book of Genesis? Why was I thrown into this pit? Did God do this to punish me? Why did this happen? Will God fix all of this? Will this pain ever go away? Will this ever turn around? Will I ever feel happy again? Job 33:29. God does all of these things to a man, twice, even 3 times, to turn back his soul from the pit, that the light of life may shine on him. The backstory. Let me shed some light and eventually a few journal entries on how things got this bad and what God was doing that I just couldn't see at the time. We had faced and overcome many challenges in our 2-year dating relationship and then throughout our marriage. I want to share a few details with you so you can understand what it looked like and felt like. The pain and suffering was very long and very real. However, most importantly, I want you to ultimately see that the details I'm going to share with you don't even matter because they are simply the effects. They are not the cause of our problem. Our problem was singular in nature. We were both sinners, trapped in sin. She claimed to be a Christian since she was 7 years old, and I became a believer in Christ in 10th grade. But we were false believers, believing in word and mind alone. But according to 1 John 2:3 through 6, we were both liars and the truth was not in us. According to Titus 1:16, we claimed to know God, but by our actions we denied him. Through this ministry at Relentless Heart, people always want to tell the details of their life problems after living in their own sin or with someone else's sin. But those details I have discovered simply don't matter. It's like going to the doctor and only focusing and obsessing about the symptoms you see on your skin, but ignoring the fact that you have an internal disease that is causing the symptoms. We aren't supposed to study or to obsess with the symptoms at the expense of finding the root issue. The root cause of your problems are your own sin and the sin of others. So please, even though I'm going to share some stories so you can relate, don't let the details of this story and the resulting evil distract you away from the most important part. We had a sin problem and a foolishness problem, and we were living according to our own natural instincts and flesh, not according to the Spirit of God, because neither of us had Him in our hearts, but only on our lips. I was a fool's fool from the very beginning. I had zeal and enthusiasm for life without any knowledge. I was completely ignorant of God's ways, and I was driven by a deep insecurity to be a people pleaser. My aim in life was to make money and then spend it on having fun and pleasure in this life. From the time I was a teenager, I was an expert at making unwise choices, and I often spent $1.50 for every dollar I made. I always lived in the moment, never thinking about tomorrow. I was too afraid to get into really big trouble, and so I avoided the obvious evils of drunkenness, drugs, partying, porno, stealing, or hurting others intentionally. However, I can remember lying several times to make myself look better with made-up stories, and one of my biggest sins I would eventually realize was having premarital sex with my girlfriends. Ephesians 5:3-7. But among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality, or of any kind of impurity, or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. For of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a man is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of such things, God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. Therefore, do not be partners with them. I was kind-hearted, but obstinate and foolish in my ways, and I wouldn't listen to any constructive criticism along the way. As it relates to my first wife, Jennifer, I saw an anger and a rage problem in her, and when mixed with my fly-by-the-seat-of-my-pants lifestyle, it was a recipe for a nuclear disaster. Whenever I made a mistake or we got into fights, there would be fits of anger and rage like I had never seen before, especially from a female. I'd like to share two stories with you that I think illustrate the kind of sin and outright evil that was the foundation of our life and marriage. At the respective ages of 20 and 18 years of age, while living together unmarried, we got into a huge fight, and she kicked me out and threw all of my clothes over the balcony. Soon, I started talking to my old girlfriend from high school in another state to see if we were supposed to still be together. We agreed to meet each other in Atlanta, Georgia, where it was inevitable that we would end up having sex. However, we also realized that the relationship had changed, and we had both become different people, so we ended up going our separate ways. Jennifer and I eventually got back together, and a few months later, she found a note in my glove box that my ex-girlfriend had placed in it during our meeting in Atlanta. Numbers 32:23. And you may be sure that your sin will find you out. Jennifer had drove up to my retail workplace and started pounding on the glass doors during a pre-opening sales meeting, demanding that I come out and be confronted about this. I left the meeting, got in my truck, where she was yelling hysterically. At one point, I looked behind the seat and found she had brought a large kitchen knife with her to talk to me. She was not able to reason through the facts that she had actually broken up with me, kicked me out of her house, and only then had I run back to this ex-girlfriend. No, in her mind, I had cheated on her. At one point, she turned sideways in the truck and she started kicking me over and over in a frightening, uncontrollable rage. Because I had seen the knife, I was too afraid to tell her the whole truth. So I only told her that my ex-girlfriend and I indeed met each other, but I lied and said we never had sex. Years later, when I would confront her boiling anger and bring this story up about the knife and of her past blow-ups, she would always say that she was thinking of taking her own life that day, not mine. Not too long after we got married, my conscience would no longer allow me to lie to her anymore, and I told her the whole truth one day about actually having sex with my ex-girlfriend that time in Atlanta. In a hysterical rage, she went down to the parking lot and kicked over my $5,000 motorcycle right off of its kickstand and onto the asphalt. She threw an ironing board down the hall at me and knocked a hole in the drywall. Her outburst was so loud that our neighbors called the police because they thought we were in there killing each other. Eventually, we got through even this and moved on. But she would never forgive me for this or forget it. It was brought up many times throughout the marriage. Let me tell you one more story. In 1997, within the first 2 years of our marriage, I went to work for a motivational speaker. Eventually, I got tired of being on the road and of working for a man who I felt was ruthless and dishonest, and a man who had changed our pay plan 10 times since I started with the company. However, only a few months after I quit, he offered Jennifer a job in a different type of position, and she couldn't resist it. I could tell she had some wild business oats to sow, and that she would never be satisfied until she got a chance to go after it. I felt she would resent me if I held her back, and since she had a college degree that had been looking like a complete waste of time, I finally agreed to let her take this job. Within a few months, she was traveling for up to 2 weeks at a time with this man and another male employee to one of his larger clients in Europe. I too was also traveling each week to the West Coast to cover my sales territory in California, Arizona, Utah, and Nevada. One time we went 6 weeks without seeing each other. One of us would fly out and leave the car at the airport, and the other would fly in and pick it up and go home until it was time to fly out again, whereupon we would leave the car at the airport for each other again. I was nervous about her being alone like this, but I kept my typical positive attitude in place and just trusted that nothing bad was going to happen. She seemed to be very happy, and she seemed to be enjoying the business environment and being on the road with what felt like a promising career around other business leaders. Soon after they finished the client training in Europe, her employer opened a mountain-style retreat center in Georgia for business and personal development seminars, where clients would now fly in to him and go through his programs. She had known how he treated me while I was working for him, and she knew that there were many sins floating around him and his organization, but she seemed to think that she could actually help him to become a better Christian. Soon, she even began telling me, "He's listening to me about God, and he's admitting to me that he was a bad father and a husband to his first wife, etc." I tried to explain to her that this was a trap and that he was now officially trying to reel her in as a young, naive Christian girl. Deep down, I initially felt that this guy had liked me and respected me so much that he would never try anything with my wife. However, he was absolutely the most gifted, brilliant manipulator I had ever seen in my life. This man could make a group of grown salesmen and sales managers cry in public at his events. He was like a cult leader. And even though you could see the evil in his life, somehow or another, you still loved the guy and you'd stick around. He had more power and charisma than any person I had ever met. I kept warning her, and she argued with me and kept insisting that God was at work and that she was making progress with him. Then came the night I tried reaching her at her hotel room all night long until 3 a.m., and she never answered. I knew then and there that something was terribly wrong. She, of course, came up with some excuse as to why it wasn't what I thought it was, but I told her that she had to quit this job and come home, or I was now going to divorce her. She came home, and we again moved on with life. About 9 years later, in 2006, I walked into a business meeting in South Florida and ran into one of my old bosses, the former vice president of sales for that very same motivational speaker who Jennifer and I had both worked for. We sat down to talk, and one thing led to another before we were talking about the old days. At one point, he began asking me how Jennifer and I had made it out of that mess in those days, and he began sharing details that led me to believe he thought I knew all the time that there had been an affair. I frantically began asking him for more information, and then he realized I didn't fully know about this. He began saying, Michael, it's in the past, man. Just put it down and leave it in the past, man. You have a nice family and a good career. Just move on, man. I was totally shocked. I went home and confronted her with the details that he had eventually shared with me. God had given me much grace that night to forgive her for all of it. But even after hours of talking, she would only ever admit to an emotional affair. I told her that she should never have any more contact with this man ever again. But shortly after that conversation, I found a call on her phone to him and discovered he was actually coming to our town to do a seminar. When I asked her why she called him, she told me it was only because she wanted to confront him in indignation about whoever it was spreading the lies about her and him before he came to town. Of course, I did not believe she was telling me the truth, but like all the other chaotic events in our life, we seemed once again to be able to sweep this under the rug, mostly for the sake of the children and the fear of divorce, and instead to just keep moving forward. About a year later, despite a pending appointment for a vasectomy, we got pregnant with the twins. The doctor advised the use of birth control, but she felt it wasn't necessary. Initially, she even considered terminating the pregnancy again with another abortion. She began exclaiming to me that her life was now over for the next 18 years. She blamed me entirely for the pregnancy, and she began to withhold all intimacy for well over a year just to punish me. Anytime I asked for physical intimacy, I was now accused of being a sex addict. My frustrations finally built up so much that one time during an argument, I cried out to God, "Why did you even give me this stupid desire for sex when it hurts so much to be denied? I hate it, God. Take it from me." I was in so much pain emotionally that I grabbed my own private parts to try to bring as much pain to myself as I could. I was truly desperate and broken from all the pain. Immediately after that, I punched a hole in my closet door because she refused to validate my feelings and my legitimate needs in the relationship. Shortly after, I found myself sitting in Barnes & Noble, unable to control my own tears in public, as I read the stories in a book entitled The Sex-Starved Marriage. Finally, all the insanity and frustration in my mind finally made sense, and I no longer felt crazy or alone or like I had done something wrong for desiring to have sex with my wife. Her anger and hatred towards me became more than I could handle, and I finally decided to end the marriage. I decided to move out, and the day I'm packing to move out, she comes in and very calmly says to me she's now heard from God that she needs to forgive me for an affair. I knew instantly what she was doing. She was the queen of manipulation, and she could figure out a way to control me in just about everything. In her fear of being rejected, ruining her own image, being alone and on her own financially since I made all the money, she had successfully figured out how to shift the power back to herself and keep me from now leaving her. I was now forced to defend myself rather than her still having to defend her own hatred and anger towards me all these years. I once again fell for her manipulation and stayed because of my own terrible fear of being a divorced Christian. However, that day, I knew she was hearing from the God of this world, Satan, not the God of heaven, because now he had shown me his hand in this very accusation. Things from here would deteriorate beyond what most people could even believe if I told you all the details. Amos 3:3. Can two walk together except they be agreed? Matthew 10:34 through 36. Do not suppose I have come to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Matthew 12:25. Jesus knew their thoughts and said to them, every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and every city or household divided against itself will not stand. This kind of chaos went on throughout most of our marriage. There were quite a few high points, but many more lows. She would regularly scream and yell or just ignore me for days to punish, control, or manipulate me into doing her will. I was rarely ever strong enough to fight back with her and win my side of the argument. She was like an impenetrable fortress that I could not break through regardless of my tactics, my perseverance, or my relentless efforts. I didn't realize it at the time, but she was indeed my Pharaoh, and God was indeed going to use her in a huge way in my spiritual life going forward. Exodus 7:3 through 4. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my miraculous signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you. Joshua 11:20. For it was the Lord himself who hardened their hearts to wage war against Israel. No matter how hard I tried, I could never change her mind or get her to see things from my perspective. I lost nearly every single battle. Each time after putting up a short fight, I'd give in, take the full blame, say I'm sorry, and then do anything I could to just keep the peace. I gave in to her over and over because truly I was powerless against her. We fought over sex, the money I spent, the friends I chose, activities I did, employees I hired, business relationships I had, house chores I didn't do enough of, the children I wasn't a good enough father to, our different intensity levels towards God, etc., etc. Many times I tried to get her to consider that she must have had something horrible to happen to her in her childhood that she wasn't being honest about, and that it could be the source of all this anger. She would always just deny that possibility and state that I was the only source of all of her life problems, that her life was just fine until she met me. I lived under this constant oppression and frustration, but unknown to me until even years after the divorce, God in his love for me and great mercy was engineering and allowing every bit of this to happen. He was using Jennifer to oppress me, control me, and ultimately break me so that I would cry out for my deliverer and humbly begin to follow God all the days of the rest of my life. I had always been that wild stallion of a horse who had no understanding and wouldn't listen to God, but instead I was out running the hills fast and wide according to my own strengths and my own will. Looking back, I cannot imagine all of the foolish decisions that God prevented me from making by putting me under the control of her and holding me back through her from all of my own desires and my own foolish plans. Psalm 32:9. Do not be like the horse or the mule, which have no understanding, but must be controlled by bit and bridle, or they will not come to you. We all come into this world naturally bent away from God and towards the world. The reason God put the Israelites into Egyptian captivity is not because they directly did anything to deserve it, but because God in his loving mercy was going to put them in a position where they would be so oppressed that they would learn to humble themselves and cry out to God Almighty for a deliverer. Joseph never did anything to deserve the Potiphar's wife in his life. David did not deserve a Saul in his life. Job did not deserve his friends. Daniel did not deserve King Cyrus. Nevertheless, God often uses painful suffering and affliction as his very best tools for refining us, disciplining us, and bringing us into his spiritual promised land, where ultimately we discover the abundant life of peace and rest. Psalm 66, 10 through 12. For you, O God, tested us. You refined us like silver. You brought us into prison and laid burdens on our backs. You let men ride over our heads. We went through fire and water, but you brought us to a place of abundance. Psalm 119:67. Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I obey your word. Psalm 119, verse 71. It was good for me to be afflicted, so that I might learn your decrees. God himself hardens the hearts of the disobedient around us, and then often uses them as tools in his hands to afflict us and oppress us for our eventual good and his ultimate glory. In 1 Samuel 16, King Saul has disobeyed God twice. And the Bible says the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit, not from the devil, an evil spirit from the Lord was sent to torment him. That evil spirit sent from God was then used for many years as a tormenting instrument of discipline in God's hands to develop the character of King David to become a ruler. Another example is seen in King Solomon, where he had allowed his wives to turn his heart and the hearts of Israel away to foreign gods. So God raises up Jeroboam, an official of Solomon's, and tells Jeroboam through a prophet that he is going to be king of Israel, stating that he is going to tear 10 tribes out of Solomon's hands and give them to him. The way he separates Israel is by hardening the heart of Solomon's son named Rehoboam. He becomes so brutal to the people that the people separate from him and eventually go to their own homes and towns. God hardened his heart and again shows us a powerful example of his sovereignty and how he uses sinful people and separation for his very good purposes. 1 Kings 12, 13 through 16. The king, Rehoboam, answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice given him by the elders. He followed the advice of the young men and said, "My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, O Israel. Look after your own house, O David." So the Israelites went home. Essentially, this is a divorce, a spiritual divorce, a family divorce, a divorce in the tribes of Israel, separation that ultimately will lead to revival. God used the hardened heart of Rehoboam not to unite Israel, but to separate 10 tribes of Israel from his hands. Joshua 11, 19 through 20. Except for the Hivites living in Gibeon, not one city made a treaty of peace with the Israelites, who took them all in battle. For it was the Lord himself who hardened their hearts to wage war against Israel. Deuteronomy 2:30. But Sihon, king of Heshbon, refused to let us pass through. For the Lord your God had made his spirit stubborn and his heart obstinate, in order to give him into your hands as he has now done. By the way, you will see that this exact thing happened in my divorce, as God would indeed, in a miracle, long after he was done using my ex-wife Jennifer in my hands, he would in fact give her into my hands in an incredible, nothing short of a parting of the Red Sea victory through that divorce trial. Exodus 7, 3 through 5. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my miraculous signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt, and with mighty acts of judgment I will bring you out. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt, and with mighty acts of judgment I will bring out my divisions, my people, the Israelites. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it. My friend, when God stretched out his hand with mighty act of judgment in my divorce case, I can tell you that I walked out of that divorce case, and within months after I discovered the 777-day divorce that God did for me, I knew that God was for me, and I knew that God was the Lord. Romans 9:15-23. Listen to this. For he, God, says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. It does not therefore depend on man's desire or effort, but on God's mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, I raised you up for this very purpose, that I might display my power in you and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. Therefore, God has mercy on whom he wants to have mercy, and he hardens whom he wants to harden. One of you will say to me, then why does God still blame us? For who resists his will? But who are you, O man, to talk back to God? Shall what is formed say to him who formed it, why did you make me like this? Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for noble purposes and some for common use? My friend, read the parable of the wheat and the tares. Verse 22, what if God, choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath prepared for destruction? What if he did this to make the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy, whom he prepared in advance for his glory? My friend, I believe very clearly God knows his elect through foreknowledge, just as it says in the Bible. And I believe what this passage of Scripture means as it relates to predestination is that even though God can look down through all of time and history and see who will choose him and open their heart to his salvation and who will harden their heart against him in the day of salvation, God does not arbitrarily choose not to make the people that he knows that are still going to reject him. God is omniscient. He knows all things before they happen. He declares the end from the beginning. So when God allows a human being to be born, even those that are the children of the devil, as Jesus Christ so clearly points out in the 8th chapter of John, is so much so that we see him tell us the parable of the wheat and tares, and he tells us the tares are children of the devil. They've been planted by the enemy who is the devil. God is pleased to allow these people to be born. Why? He uses them for his glory. He uses them as tools in his hands to prepare us. It is an incredible wisdom that God has to do these things. It is one of God's ways that are so higher than the ways of man. Man always wants to say, why, if there's such a loving God, is the world filled with so evil? Why are there still allowed to be such sinners? Why are people allowed to be atheists? And why are people allowed to do all these hurtful things? My friend, here is the answer. It's clear as day. My life testifies to it. Continuing on. There seems to have been one chaotic event after another in our marriage, but by far the best year we ever had was in 2007. For the previous year and a half, we had been in a tailspin towards matrimonial death, often hanging on by a mere thread. I stopped just short of moving out in 2008 and ending the marriage. I was just trying to follow this strong call in my soul to give up chasing and maintaining the quote-unquote good life and instead to pursue God's purpose and will for my life. I had the beautiful family, the business success, and the good life, but I had no peace or joy in my soul. I was no longer interested in serving money and killing myself to live in $1 million home with a private movie theater or sending our children to private school. I wanted to simplify our life and business so that I could be more free to follow Christ's will for my life and for our life as a family. This created fight after fight after fight. I would now eventually accuse her of not loving God and of having a serious anger problem, and she in turn would accuse me of being bipolar. I wanted her to go to counseling, and she wanted me to go to a psychiatrist. Beneath everything that I could perceive with my five senses, There was an epic spiritual battle brewing that I did not yet perceive or have spiritual wisdom to understand. So God was going to have to intervene and teach me. Okay, I'm going to let this be the end of this recording, and in the next recording, I'm going to begin to tell you the story about how God started to open my eyes to spiritual warfare. The spiritual warfare that was behind the scenes working all these details that I'm beginning to share and struggle with in my life at this point. Okay, my eyes open to spiritual warfare, okay. Okay, I'm going to end this recording for here. And in the next part, I'm going to start by explaining to you the story about how God began to actually open my eyes to the spiritual warfare that was beginning to direct all these difficult circumstances and afflictions in my life. May God bless you as you continue to follow along this journey and listen. I pray that you're encouraged, and I pray that you can see that no matter what you've allowed to happen in your life, or no matter what anybody else has done to you in your life, if you will humbly cry out to God, depending upon God alone, and if you will seek His face through His Word and seek to understand His ways, God can indeed forgive you and anyone in your life from every wrong that's ever been committed, every sin that you've ever walked in. He can turn around every foolish mistake you've ever made, begin to redeem it, and ultimately, through faith and patience, you too can inherit an abundant spiritual life. And I pray that God does that for you as you continue to trust in Him. I was shocked and I was completely humiliated all at the same time. It was one of the most disrespectful and humiliating things she had ever done to me in front of others. I could feel my blood starting to boil. And within just minutes of driving down the highway, I blew up and just screamed at her for like 5 minutes in total disgust that she continued to accept zero responsibility for anything wrong in the marriage. Finally, I caught my breath, I shut up, and we drove home in complete silence. I had been very ready to leave the marriage several other times over the years, and I had always stayed. But now I felt absolutely certain I was dead inside and the marriage must be over. By the time we arrived at home, I was so angry and in so much pain that I wanted to leave the house and just go stay with a friend. I could not even stand to hear her voice at this point. It was already 11:30 at night, but I started texting a few friends to see if I could come stay at their place. I had just sold my truck, another way to try to make her happy. And so all I had at the time was my street motorcycle. When she saw how seriously upset I was, she began to try to appease me to stay. When she saw I was not budging, she began threatening to call the police if I left without telling her where I was going. She kept saying she was worried about me leaving on New Year's Eve and driving somewhere on my motorcycle at night. I was done talking. The righteous, Mark 2:17. And he said that he who has been forgiven much sin will love God much, Luke 7:47. In an affront to legalistic or self-righteous people who look down on others, God was even pleased to bring the life and salvation of His Son Jesus Christ directly through a genealogy filled with sin and scandal. In a quick reading of Jesus' family line in Matthew 1, we can find incest, Tamar and Judah, intermarriage, Boaz and Ruth, prostitution, Rahab, and adultery, and even murder, David and Bathsheba. God's word is very transparent, and it does not try to whitewash or hide the dirt in the lives of some of its most beloved personalities. But on the contrary, it actually showcases their raw trials, their scandals, and their sins. As a result, you and I can read the Bible and say, wow, if God can forgive and use him or her, surely He can forgive and use me. I too am following this pattern and sharing of my personal journal entries in this program by transparently sharing details from my own life in hopes that you'll be encouraged and able to also say, wow, if God can forgive and redeem the mess in Michael's life, surely He can do so in my life as well. My journal entries and the stories that I'm going to share include the life and sins of some others. The songs all declared God's greatness, His protection, His love, and His presence. But He was nowhere to be found in that dark, cold office. I was frozen in fear. This was going to be the devil's night, and somehow I just knew it. The music was still blaring when suddenly I heard two loud bangs against the door, and bam! The double doors into my office busted open. I looked up and saw a police officer looking at me over my desk. He yelled, "Mr. Chriswell, are you okay?" I honestly thought I was seeing things. It took him all about 3 steps into my office when I realized that this was for real. And my mind began screaming, she did it. She actually went this far. Before I begin to share some of the darkest parts of my personal life, I first want to remind you that the Bible is a true story of paradise lost by sinners and paradise again being found by sinners. The good news of God's salvation through Jesus Christ can only be fully understood and appreciated when, by God's grace, we can see it through the lens of our own past ignorance, filth, foolishness, sins, and even rebellion against God. Christ Himself said He came to save lost sinners, not 11:35 p.m., New Year's Eve. On a night that is meant for celebrating the arrival of a new year and a fresh new start, a time when you're supposed to rejoice with special friends and family, I was all alone and scared to death about our future. While all 5 of our small children were peacefully asleep in their rooms, I was about to taste hell on just the other side of the house. The memory of me sitting on the back porch just weeks earlier telling the devil, "Go ahead, take your best shot," flooded my mind. Her parents had agreed to watch the children on New Year's Eve 2009. My wife Jennifer and I went to dinner at the Cape Canaveral Pier House restaurant, and I was so hopeful that the evening alone at the ocean might help each of us to catch our breath and make one more attempt at moving forward rather than quitting on our marriage. Dinner was rather uneventful, even sort of pleasant. So to me, I had a small glimmer of hope as we left the restaurant that night. On the way home, we decided to stop by my father's house to let him and my stepbrother know that we couldn't go with them on New Year's Day. They came to the door and I began apologizing, saying that Jennifer and I had been having some serious problems in our marriage, but that we were going to be trying to get some help and to work on it. Just then, she cut me off, grabbed my arm, looked at both of them and said, "No, we don't have problems. Michael has some problems, and Michael is going to be going to a psychiatrist to get some help." I was stunned who were involved. I have changed the names or even left out the names of a few to protect their identity. Having said that, I wish to point out that there are no sinners in any of these stories that I have not completely forgiven, and more importantly, who couldn't be forgiven by the grace of God through their sincere faith and repentance, should God grant it to them. 2 Timothy 2:25. I would also like to make it clear that the worst of sins committed against me by God's grace have all turned to be the very best things that have ever happened to me spiritually, and I am so thankful for each and every one of them now. I do not in any way despise the discipline God has given me, nor the tools or people He's used to do so. God, in His infinite wisdom, knows the exact kind of suffering and affliction we each need to become more like Jesus Christ to his glory, which is his ultimate purpose in creating us and saving us. Romans 8:29. May God bless you as you listen. Matthew 10:27. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. Ephesians 5:11, 13 through 14. Have nothing to do with fruitless deeds of darkness. Rather, expose them. Everything exposed by the light becomes visible, for it is the light that makes everything visible. December 31st, 2009.